And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, and then translate them into lessons that we can act on, that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today is the final episode of a four-part series that I've been doing on the work of Alfred Thayer Mahan, one of the best-known naval strategists who ever lived. He wrote an enormously influential book, interestingly enough, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. The book was written in 1890, and it synthesized roughly, in theory, a century of naval warfare and commerce, but really extended back farther than that. And it was a look at how the United States Navy and commerce in the United States could essentially work together to strengthen the nation, both militarily and economically. And so today, as I mentioned a moment ago, this is going to be the last episode in this series. I've looked at 5 ideas from Mahan's book over the preceding 3 weeks, and so I'm going to look at 5 more today and wrap things up. So, previously I've talked about such issues as geography creates opportunity, logistics are a strategic weapon, and concentration beats dispersion. So all of these principles, and you can go back and watch the previous episodes on my YouTube channel. Just go to youtube.com/The Way to Wow. And see how this great naval strategist, how he's so relevant to doing business today. Many of you may have heard of Sun Tzu, who wrote the classic military doctrinal text, The Art of War. It's been almost essentially literally translated into a business text and is well known for that. So I think it's a shame that other military texts haven't been treated the same way. And now that I'm talking about it now, maybe I'll have to do that myself, right? Let's see, is the influence of sea power upon history, is it out of copyright? I think so. It's been over 100 years, 135 years since it was written. I'll have to give that some thought. In any event, I'm going to start with the first of the 5 final points, which is leadership quality determines outcomes. So skilled leaders maximized national advantage, and poor leaders squandered what were oftentimes superior resources. So we can see this in somebody like a Horatio Nelson, about whom I've done an episode on this show, where Nelson was an inspiring leader. He was a brilliant strategist and tactician. He was brave. His men loved serving under him. And so through an individual like Admiral Nelson, national advantage was maximized. He wasn't just beloved by his sailors. He was beloved by the English people in general. And so to have that kind of inspired leadership has a national impact beyond just that particular military branch. The flip side is poor leaders squandered superior resources. So if we look at, let's let's look at Pearl Harbor, which is probably the most notable defeat suffered by, well, actually, no, let's look at Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a better example, right? The United States clearly had superior resources, but poor leadership squandered that advantage. Now, one could, I think, cogently argue, well, the unequal warfare where we had the United States had tremendously powerful conventional forces fighting against sort of terrorist bands. That sort of unequal warfare, it really undermines the advantage of the superior resources. Well, only if the superior resources are used incorrectly, right? So the United States has the ability to train and equip any kind of force that it wants. It may take it more time to to equip to train and equip a force to be able to respond effectively to this unequal warfare. But that's what war and the military are about. So to say that well, it was just that we were fighting an enemy that didn't allow us to bring our superior resources to bear. That's not a correct excuse or a correct rationale. The rationale was the leadership did not observe that and take that issue under investigation and figure out, okay, that being the case, how do we fight this war successfully, right? And there were things that were tried, but none of them worked particularly well. And then with the precipitous withdrawal, um, any advantage, any chance at finding the right way to respond to the Taliban threat in Afghanistan was lost, right? So that is first and foremost a matter of poor leadership. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday. I don't want to say who he was because the people we were talking about would then know they were being talked about. But the company for which he works is not operating particularly well, and there's a reason, and it's because there's poor leadership throughout the company. And he kept giving me reasons that would sort of exculpate the leaders of the company from responsibility. And I kept saying, I'm not saying they're horrible people. I'm just saying they're not leading well in this situation. And to suggest that they are is to mask over the root of the problems the company is having, and therefore to essentially dismiss chances of success for the company. So there's a couple of factors, a couple of ways that this translates to the business world. And one is the quality of leadership. And the one of the most important factors determining quality of leadership is their willingness to accept responsibility for the mistakes that they've made, for the quality of their leadership. A leader who is unwilling to accept that, okay, is an inferior leader. Full stop. Okay. So how we present our culpability as leaders to our team, okay, that's a separate issue. Okay. We don't have to go in front of them and do a struggle session. Oh, I'm inadequate, I'm this, I'm that. No, I'm not suggesting that at all. But what we have to do as leaders is evaluate the quality of our leadership, identify the places where it's lacking, and then solve those lacks, fill in those gaps. It may be that we need to bring someone on board who has a skill that we lack and essentially hand that aspect over to that person. Okay? That may be something we have to do. That's superior leadership. Okay. I would venture to say that Admiral Nelson was probably not a particularly skilled logistician. Okay. But I would bet you that he had sailors, officers in his fleet who were experts, on whom he knew he could rely. That's what's important. And then he essentially followed their advice, right? Now, of course, as the most senior commander, if they made a mistake, the eventual responsibility rests with him. Nonetheless, we need to give the broadest authority to act to those members of our team who are filling in our own weaknesses. That's crucial. Okay, that's what good leadership is. It's recognizing our weaknesses and backfilling them. Okay, so that's one aspect of superior leadership. Another is making sure there's leadership in depth. So many years ago, when I had my real estate company, I was asked to go up to Seattle and then Alaska to do a collateral review for a company. In this case, I was looking at their real estate. And one of the things I noticed about this company, which was looking to borrow at the time, I think it was close to $200 million, if I remember correctly. Okay. And that's a lot of money right now. Back then, it was even more because we're talking 30 plus years ago. Okay. So there was no depth of leadership in this company at all. The CEO of the company, he had a good handle on everything that was going on. However, he was an older man, not in the greatest of health. And if something had happened to him, it's very likely the company would have fallen apart. And I passed that information along to the lender who had sent me to do the collateral review. And I said, I know you're not asking me to point these kind of things out to you. I said, but I feel obligated to let you know there is no depth of leadership here. There is no one who can backfill for the number one guy. Not even close. The other people weren't bad people. They're very nice. Right? And they were excellent at saying, yes, sir. Which, by the way, wasn't there. I suspect it wasn't their fault that there was no depth of leadership. I think it was the number one guy's fault because he didn't want to be challenged. And that's fine, but I wouldn't want to be lending $200 million to a company like that. And in the event, that along with some other issues made the lender pass. And I know another lender who made that loan, and it was part of putting them out of business. That's how bad the situation was, right? So we need to fill in talent gaps, and we need to have depth of leadership. Having qualified, superior leaders, more junior to us, is not a threat to our leadership. It's a benefit to the organization. It should help us sleep better at night, knowing if we get sick, we get injured, that the organization will be able to continue. And by the way, if we're so insecure in our ability that we don't want to have quality leaders who are junior to us, that's our problem. We can't make that a problem for our organizations. Okay, so leadership quality determines outcomes. That's number one. Number two, institutional culture sustains power. So the Royal Navy, as a cultural institution, had traditions that dated in some cases for centuries. Okay? And those traditions still to this day permeate the United States Navy. They they reinforce discipline. They reinforce a sense of continuity. They reinforce a sense of attachment to the institution. So to this day, when I hear of the blow of a bosun's pipe, it takes me back not just to my days in the Navy, but it connects me to centuries of naval history, because the bosun's pipe was how was part of the system of giving orders back in the day of wooden ships. Okay, and calling the crew to man the sails or man the capstan, or or calling them to grog, or all of these naval traditions. Okay, some of which we don't do anymore. We don't issue grog on American ships any longer. More's the pity, I think sometimes. But those kinds of traditions, the uniforms that we wear, this is an area where I think the United States Navy has done itself a tremendous disservice. So this seems like it's in constant flux, but I know when I was assigned, right before I was assigned to Carrier Air Wing 14, the sort of regular shipboard uniform for officers and chief petty officers was changed from the khaki uniform that what were called wash khakis, that was worn even when my dad was in the Navy, and from before that. It was my dad's favorite uniform. My dad used to talk about how he would get his newly laundered khakis when they had starch, and then he'd put his arm through the sleeves, and it would be like shh, as the sleeve, as he pushed his way through the sleeve. If you've ever worn a well starched garment, right? They were crisp, they looked good, right? So that uniform was replaced by what was derisively called blueberries. It was this blue camouflaged uniform. It looked sloppy, it was uncomfortable, completely impractical for shipboard wear. And I remember I got to CAG 14, and the first thing I did was I bought my wash khakis, and then the captain of the ship on which we deployed, the USS Ronald Reagan, decided he was going to institute the wearing of blueberries early. And I never got to wear my wash khakis on official duty. Huge mistake on the part of the captain of the ship, on the part of the Navy. And it was, I mean, from a practical standpoint, if someone fell overboard in these blueberries, you would never see them. Okay. The idea of camouflaging yourself in the ocean when all we want to do is get you out of the drink, right? Absolutely crazily foolish, right? And you say, okay, well, but that's just one little thing, right? But it's an attitude toward naval tradition that reflected badly on the institutional culture. And the Navy stumbled through all kinds of different iterations. They've never figured out that they just need to go back to what they were doing, in 2009, right? Where again, officers and chief petty officers wore khakis, and petty officers and sailors wore, I think it was kind of a blue uniform. Okay. And the blue uniform wasn't particularly good. They need to go back to wearing, dungarees and t-shirts, which was a great uniform. You see it in World War II movies. It was comfortable. They got more comfortable the more times you washed them, right? That's the nature of blue jeans, which is essentially what dungarees are, right? There was no reason to change that. There just no reason, okay? Except that the Navy got it in its head that if we change this, sailors are going to enlist more frequently, or more people are going to enlist, and they're going to be happier. No, and everything that's come since the dungarees and t-shirts, sailors haven't liked, okay? It's part of a sailor's ethos to gripe, okay? That's just how it is, especially on shipboard, right? So it's crucial to maintain institutional culture, because that's what sustains the ethos, the sort of, fighting spirit of a Navy. And the fact of the matter is, these institutions outlive every individual. Okay. This is one of the things I've tried to explain to both sailors and my civilian colleagues. The Navy essentially exists apart from any of her sailors, right? So when a sailor does something wrong, okay, that is the officer or sailor's responsibility. Okay. The Navy, this institution that now is over 2 centuries old, it's a noble institution that wants to fulfill its duty to serve and defend the United States of America. That sometimes the Navy is served poorly by officers and sailors is not, it's not that the Navy is bad, it's that the individuals are. Now, you could argue, well, the Navy hasn't trained them well enough. Okay. In some cases, that's true. Okay. But in many cases, it's that the person let their ego run away with them. They let their problems in their life capture them. And they did something they shouldn't have done, that they got lazy. Okay. Um, while I would say the institutional culture of the Navy has declined over time. Okay, the strength of it, the quality of it. That's because the officers primarily, and in most cases, the most senior officers, the admirals, have allowed that to happen rather than maintain standards. That's a failing of those admirals who have in their hand the maintenance of the institutional culture. They have failed the Navy. The Navy wants to be great. She wants to serve with distinction. If her officers let her down, okay, that is not really the fault of the Navy. That's the fault of the officers. It's the fault of the leadership, the national leadership that would appoint, that would not appoint, but select such admirals to put in their care this precious institution. Okay, that may sound sentimental, but I'm sentimental about my Navy, our Navy. So, from a business standpoint, okay, every business needs to develop a culture. And hopefully, it is a culture that inspires people who work at that business to excel. Okay. Now, I'm currently overseeing the operations of a company where, for over 2 decades, the culture of the organization was one of harshness. It did not encourage professional growth. It did not encourage the people who work there to excel, to build their skills. And it's really a shame, because the people who were so loyal to this business did not have a chance to grow. Now, over the last 2 years that I've been overseeing this business, they've had a lot more opportunity to grow, to expand what they're doing, to take on more responsibility, to have a personal stake in the success or failure of the business. And it's been wonderful to watch these people blossom and to work with them to build the kind of culture in which everyone has an opportunity to thrive. Okay? That doesn't mean we don't work hard, because we do. Okay? And it doesn't mean that we don't hold ourselves accountable for mistakes. We do. That's part of the culture too. Okay? But the dominant aspect of the culture, and a lot of it in my case, because being in the Navy was such a formative period for me, and unlike my first real estate company, where I didn't have full-time employees and that sort of thing for very long, I really take a lot from what I learned in the Navy in terms of working within an organization and bring that to this particular company for which I'm responsible, and to because that institutional culture and how it supports us as a team, how it helps us do quality work for our clients and customers, right? That's in many cases I've taken directly from my time in the United States Navy. Okay, and you know, if we have a strong culture, so it will allow our people to really build a great business, and it will sustain a company beyond its founders. Okay, whereas if we have a weak culture, it creates a great deal of fragility. And in fact, when I took over this business, it was touch and go. It was touch and go as to whether it was going to survive, because the culture was borderline abusive, and the people who worked at this company, no one could have blamed them if, when the owner of the company died, they had just jumped ship basically and said, okay, I'm done with this, right? And so it was incumbent upon me to come in and very quickly demonstrate to them that the institutional culture was going to change. Okay, all right. Public support enables long-term strategy. This is number 3. Okay, so naval expansion requires political backing. So whether we're talking about the Royal Navy or the United States Navy, or for that matter, any Navy, a Navy is expensive. We have to build ships. We have to man ships. We have to supply ships. None of that is inexpensive. It all costs a lot of money. And whether we're talking about building, square-rigged wooden ships in the 19th century and before, or whether we're talking about building steel-hulled ships now, or composite material ships now, there's no such thing as an inexpensive Navy. This was for a long time the reason why the United States Navy remained relatively small, because there wasn't a lot of public support for building and manning a large Navy. It wasn't until really around the time of the Civil War, when the when the Union needed to blockade the Confederacy, that it became obvious that a larger Navy was necessary, and that the cost of it would be well spent. So, but it needs both political support from, in this case, national leaders, but it also requires popular support from the people in a country like England and the United States, where these are essentially small r Republican governments, right? They're representative governments. So if the citizens of the country, or the subjects in the case of Great Britain of the country, won't support a navy, won't support a larger navy, it's going to be difficult to raise the money to build and maintain it, right? And so part of what a navy has to do is demonstrate its value, right? This is why someone like a Horatio Nelson was so important to the Royal Navy's success. To have this superb, charismatic officer in the news doing great things for England or for Great Britain caused the average person to take pride in the Royal Navy. This is why in the United States, an officer like John Paul Jones, David Farragut, and then moving into World War II, Nimitz, Chester Nimitz, and Leahy. I'm going up on Leahy's first name. All of these great naval leaders. It's why they were so important. They captured the public's imagination. They accomplished great things for the country, and they engendered the support of the American people, in the case of Great Britain, of the people of Great Britain. Okay, and so this is what this is what is necessary for sustained investment. Okay, and you can look over the history of the United States, and you can see that support for the military kind of waxes and wanes politically. Okay, as politicians are reading the sort of temperament of the citizenry. But it's interesting. I think the citizenry, it waxes and wanes far less with the average citizen. So sort of the wisdom of the masses, so to speak, I think is reliable here. Okay, so with a business, then we need to build support among the public. Now, who is the public in a business? It's not necessarily the entire public the way it is with a Navy. Okay, and you've heard this term stakeholders before, and I think it gets both underused and, or I'm sorry, overused and misused, right? In how it's applied to running a company. You hear about stakeholder capitalism. Well, that's I don't find any validity in that concept. What I find where I do find validity is recognizing that for a company to win, if you will, it needs to have a long-term strategy to retain the support of the people who work at the company, so that they feel they're being treated well, and they're being and they have they're motivated to work for the company. They're given opportunities for professional growth. Okay, my friend Bill and I talk about this, from time to time. If a company is afraid of its people growing so much that they're going to leave the company, that's a really poor attitude. Okay, the greatest thing a company can be is one where people go and they learn and they grow and they move on to even better opportunities than there are at the company that nurtured them, because they're almost for sure going to feel a connection back to that company, and so that company's influence now expands throughout the business world. Okay, that's just how it works. So we want to inspire uh, loyalty in our people, but a broader loyalty where they know that what we want always is the best for them, even if that means they have to move on to find the next opportunity that'll allow them to grow. Sometimes we just there's a limit to what we can offer, but we should keep training our people so that they outgrow us, basically. Okay, so that's the kind of support, that's what we can do to engender that kind of the kind of rock solid support from our employees. We want the same kind of relationship with our clients and customers. We want the same kind of relationship, or same, I should not same kind, same quality of relationship with our clients and customers, the same quality of relationship with our suppliers, with our vendors, with the people who provide us with insurance, with our professionals who handle tax compliance, who help us deal with legal issues. Okay, would that we could have that same kind of relationship with government officials who have the responsibility to see that laws and regulations are enforced. That may be tougher, particularly in a jurisdiction like California, where it seems like those relationships are many times fraught. Okay, but we it should be part of our institutional culture, to go back to number two, to create strong, abiding, mutually supportive relationships with everyone with whom the company deals okay, as a long-term strategy for the success of the company. Okay, number 4, strategic patience wins wars. So when we look at uh, how navies win wars, while the sort of most gallant aspects of naval warfare oftentimes are the sort of single ship the single ship on ship battles that were sometimes fought in the 19th century, or something like the Battle of Midway, which was a decisive American victory during World War II in the Pacific theater, and probably was the turning point in that theater of operations. Okay. The reality is the reason the United States won World War II was because uh, it had endurance, which allowed it to be patient. Okay, because the United States had to learn how to fight effectively in the Pacific. Okay, it wasn't knowledge that the United States Navy had. They had theory, but theory oftentimes doesn't play out the way planners think it will when actual operations commence. Okay, and so that had to be figured out. Now, it's a difficult equation because if one is in a war, okay, which means among other things that people are dying, being killed. So the Americans don't have a whole lot of patience for watching the what body counts, Lahabdil, mount. Right? They don't like to see that. Having said that, it's incumbent upon leaders to explain why patience is required. And indeed, in any kind of sustained military operation, that is the most crucial task for civilian leadership, is to explain why we civilians, okay, need to be patient to give a military strategy the time required for it to be successful, right? So, we saw in the first Gulf War, right, where we're talking about the whole shock and awe thing, like, wow, we could win a victory really quickly. Well, yes and no. Certainly, the military portion of that campaign went off quickly and well. But the longer term war for turning turning the tide of how things were happening in that area of the world, there was not sufficient patience for it. And there were a lot of other problems, by the way, as well. Right? Same thing happened in Afghanistan. So people were asked to be patient, and yet there didn't seem to be a coherent way, a coherent strategy for really winning true victory there. So time favors disciplined powers, powers who are disciplined and committed to figuring out the way to achieve victory. Okay, so patience in a vacuum is not sustainable. Patience in the face of failure after failure is also not sustainable. What militaries need to do, and civilian leadership who control them need to do, is create the atmosphere for patience while working very, very hard to make the changes that need to be made to adapt to the current military situation that will bring victory as quickly as possible. Both of those things can be true at the same time. So, from a business standpoint, when we talk about strategic patience, really what we're looking at is creating a platform for sustainable growth. And that beats rapid expansion. So last week, a colleague of mine asked me to attend a meeting with somebody that he knew. I knew the person as well, kind of on an acquaintance level. And the person with whom we were meeting was counseling us to like really ramp up and go for, very rapid growth because, he had been successful in doing that with his business. And I said to him, I'm not looking for that kind of rapid growth. That's as likely to put me out of business as it is to make me a lot of money. Because the kind of work that I do requires close, strong relationships with all of the people with whom I'm involved. And so I'm much better off having a measured, sustainable path toward expansion. Okay. Rather than trying to get a whole bunch of clients that then I try and take care of, and in doing so make a lot of mistakes, and then they don't want to do business with me anymore. Okay. So different businesses have different paths to expansion. Now, for his business, because he's part of a huge organization, okay, all he's responsible for in actuality is being in touch with the clients. Everything else happens in the background. Okay. But that's not how my business works. So I don't turn around and have a big team back here. I build those teams, and I have to build them individually on a bespoke nature, to use a clothing term. They're bespoke teams for each client to make sure that things are working as efficiently as possible, and to make sure that the client's goals are being met. And different people have different goals, right? So what I do is too diverse to have, to assume any particular client's goals. Okay. So sustainable growth typically beats rapid expansion, number one, or part A. And part B, endurance is a competitive weapon. So our ability to continue operating through economic vicissitudes, ups, downs, shocks in the market, all the sort of craziness that goes on in business, our ability to endure is what will allow us to be triumphant over the long term. Okay. And strategic patience is part of that. Okay. We can't let our desire for growth outpace what will allow us to sustain and build a business on a firm foundation. Okay. Finally, number 5. Decline comes from complacency, not competition. So it's, I think, a misnomer that that military defeat comes from competition, comes from a better, stronger military, so to speak. A battle may be won on that basis, where we're the other side is just much stronger than we are. Okay. But it's really complacency that delivers the ultimate defeat. Okay. So if we look at how close things actually were for the United States at the beginning of World War II, we had let the Army and Navy shrink to a very small size after World War I. Okay, we were ill-equipped to deal with any kind of sustained ground and sea-based operations. That was the choice that American leadership made in the interwar years, and people didn't object, and the American people didn't object. Okay, they were on some level, maybe a little too strong a word, traumatized by what happened in World War I. But as a result, okay, we lost a huge battle in Pearl Harbor, and that sort of awakened us out of our stupor. and out of our complacency, and we realized we had to reverse the decline. Okay, which is, if we had lost World War II, it wouldn't have been because of the competition. It would have been essentially a self-inflicted wound, because we had let our military and our Army and Navy decline so badly. Okay, so militaries need to be constantly adapting in order to keep pace with the reality of what's going on geopolitically. Okay, now I have I have mixed feelings about some of these issues as they impact the United States Navy. So the idea of unmanned ships, ships that don't have sailors on them, it's just not the Navy that I know. The idea of unmanned aircraft replacing pilots in fighter jets and tanker jets, and all the other platforms that flew as part of the air wing when I was the chaplain there. It makes me frankly sad to think that there may very well be a day within my lifetime that such things will go away, and we won't have the camaraderie of the ready room, and the kind of camaraderie we had uh, um, in the wardroom, that where the officers ate their meals. But that's not the point of the United States Navy. The point of the United States Navy is to defend and support the interests of the United States of America. And so, how do we do that most effectively and with the least loss of human life, right? And the reality is that if we can fly unmanned aircraft as effectively or more effectively than manned aircraft, then we should. You look at how ships are built today, and how they look. They're not nearly as graceful as ships during World Wars I and II. They just don't have, to my eye anyway, the kind of beauty and sleekness that those ships have. They look kind of stodgy in some cases, and all of that. But the reality is that as radar deception technology advances, as how ships are used changes, and all of that means the form of the ships have to change as well, and utility has to be the guiding factor, not the beauty of a ship. And it's sad for those of us who knew a different Navy, but we do have to adapt. The Navy has to adapt to remain relevant in fulfilling its duty to the nation, right? And so, and oftentimes what happens is a Navy is so successful that leadership again becomes kind of complacent, like, we've been so successful, we don't need to change anything. No, that's not true. Okay. Just because we've been successful in the past doesn't mean we'll be successful in the future. Those are two different time frames, right? And it's the responsibility of leadership, especially the most senior leadership in the case of the Navy and admirals, to make sure that adaptation does not lag behind reality. Okay, and to make that case to civilian leadership and to the American people. So the same thing happens in businesses. So successful businesses often breed blind spots. Okay, we're so successful, we don't see that we're lagging behind the reality of the marketplace. So I think Walmart is kind of a good example, right? How did Amazon become so huge a part of retail sales when Walmart was the largest retailer, I think, in the world, certainly in this country, right? And it's because I think they were blinded by their success. They didn't see what the internet meant in terms of better serving retail customers. Okay. And so, because of that, that was a factor of decline. The decline came through complacency. It wasn't as if somehow Amazon, beat up Walmart. They didn't. Amazon just worked to be successful. Walmart was complacent, and so Amazon overtook them. And it took Walmart a long time to realize the predicament in which they were and to start innovating again and start building up their online business, etc. And it's been a rough situation for Walmart. Now they're finally, I think, doing well, and they've become somewhat of a formidable competitor to Amazon. Okay, but it's the problem was Walmart's, not Amazon's. Okay, and you can see how various ones of these issues I brought up today are interrelated. There was a leadership problem, it would appear, at Walmart that didn't see that they were being complacent. So the lack of qualified enough leaders there caused them to go into a decline, primarily from complacency or from lack of vision. Okay, not necessarily exactly the same thing, but related, right? So as a result, they lost some of their public support because customers went and started shopping on Amazon, right? So all of these issues interplay, and they're part of the larger picture, of which especially senior leadership needs to stay aware. And that is, in the end, the lesson of Alfred Thayer Mahan in his great book, the history of the influence of sea power upon history. No single factor is crucial. It's all these factors working together that keep a Navy strong and allow it to work with the commercial aspects of a country to make that country great. Okay. So I've talked about 20 issues over the last 4 weeks. All of these issues work together. I'm not saying, by the way, that my list is exhaustive. I brought the ones that I thought would be most interesting for you to hear. But no issue in isolation is so crucial that it overarches all the others. It's how these issues work together. Okay. They're not all necessarily of equal importance. Quality of leadership is among the most important because it's within leadership's responsibility and hopefully ability to deal with maintaining public support, to combat complacency. Okay. So as you look at your businesses, as you look at the various issues that I've raised over the last 4 weeks, I encourage you to think of how they can work in concert to improve how your business operates. So I thank you very much for joining me today. Got some live viewers, always terrific to see you. And if you have any questions, comments, criticisms, etc., links to my social media will be in the show notes. I invite you to post them. And let's see, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. So I hope you'll join me for that. And every other Thursday is my show, Jiggers' Place, at 5 p.m. Pacific time. We have a cocktail and a schmooze. So as those come up, I hope you'll join me for those as well. And then, of course, next week, full slate of shows. So I thank you again very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this series. I'm planning on doing more series for business lessons from the military, because I think they help us develop an overall better outlook and strategy for our companies. So looking forward to doing more of this in the weeks to come. So thanks again for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.